So in contextualizing kind of the panel, the first panel in Iran, I'd like to offer a couple of thoughts about why ADL? We see Iran as a perpetrator in many arenas. On the nuclear issue, we're concerned. In terms of its behavior around the region, we're very concerned. And what it does to its own people ultimately is what moves us more than anything else. We feel that ADL's authentic voice is in looking at what Iran does to its own citizens. Of course, we care deeply also about the threat of Iran to the state of Israel and its security as an organization that defends the state of Israel, believes in its existence as a Jewish and democratic state. Any strategic threat to Israel is a concern for us. And also as a main perpetrator and exporter of anti-Semitic rhetoric, as the #1 exporter of anti-Semitic rhetoric around the world, as well as violence, is an issue that we at the ADL care deeply about.
Thank you everyone so much for coming this afternoon, and to Sharon for those introductions. As she said, I'm Scott Wiener. I'm the Arabian Peninsula and Iran analyst for the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. We are an independent, nonpartisan U.S. government agency which monitors and reports on violations of religious freedom worldwide. Our annual report was just released yesterday, and if you'd like to take a look, you can find it at usurf.gov. Since 2006, Iran has been listed as a country of particular concern, which are countries that meet the standard of systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations of international standards for religious freedom. And as we look to Iran now, the government has been under pressure both from the outside and also from within. Internationally, we've seen pressure from the U.S. administration's maximum pressure campaign and increasingly from U.S. allies as well. Domestically, protest activity, which has taken place since December 2017, coupled with flooding in recent months, has also put pressure on the regime. And we've seen this pressure manifest itself on many minority communities which live in the country.
Iran probably is much more heterogeneous as a society with the kind of life and protection for minority communities that most would think it's not so bad, actually. Jews and Christians are protected in Iran. Therefore, Jewish community in Iran, for example, is able to experience the religious life, have access to wine as part of religious ceremony, even though the regime does not allow that for its own citizens. So on the surface, Iran, compared to Saudi Arabia, might seem much more tolerant, might seem there's a lot more room for religious minorities to live their lives according to their faith. But in reality, and I'll speak a little bit about the Jewish community, the reality is that the political implications of a religious minority that also is seen as, at any moment, a representative of another country, let's say Israel, makes their lives so difficult that at any moment, knowing that you can be called a Zionist spy, puts pressures on their daily lives, which means they have to not only repress their own Jewish identity and values, but also sometimes go above and beyond to show their anti-Israel sentiment. So does that happen in Saudi Arabia? No, because they're really, you don't have that kind of engagement in a country like Saudi Arabia. But in terms of the daily lives of minorities in Iran, their lives are not only second class, but sometimes third class citizens. And therefore, the difficulties they live with is in some ways unique and different and much more pressured. In a country like Saudi Arabia, there are minorities like the Sunni, like the Shiite minorities and other kinds of Sunnis who are not Wahhabi, but for sure the distinctions are less, and you don't have this pressure of external forces playing in your daily lives. Jews in Iran, for example, have to turn out and demonstrate against Israel. They have to go and participate in marches and demonstrations against the state of Israel, and they're held responsible of times for policies enacted by the state of Israel. So this is a kind of a complicating factor for many communities that is just not replicated in other parts of the Middle East in some ways.
As an Iranian, and as many Iranians, they don't like to be compared to other countries. They like to be compared to their own potentials and what happened in their recent past. So I don't think that an average Iranian is going around and compare the situation of his country or her country to Saudi Arabia, where, of course, Christians have no right to build a church, or there are no Jews to be suppressed, or no Christians to be suppressed. And, 37 Shias were beheaded a couple of weeks ago, and last week, yeah. And one of them, after beheading, was crucified. So this is not the way that Iranians look at their situation and, the past and future of their country. They look at their country as the country of Cyrus the Great, the only non-Jew, the only human being who was called a god in the Old Testament. They look at the situation of their country before the revolution, where there was, a vibrant community. Of course, there was a dictatorship and there was political suppression, but at the same time, minorities were not suppressed because of their faith. So Iranians see a potential in their country, and they see a wasted opportunity of those potentials. And what we have tried in the past few years as well is to talk about this cost of discrimination to Iran as a whole. And, we made a film with the Baha'i community, for example. A couple of years ago, we compared the situation of the Baha'is to the blacks and colored, quote-unquote, colored people in apartheid South Africa. And we called the film Cost of Discrimination, meaning what is the cost to the country itself. So going to your second question about the protest, I think many of the protests that have been happening in Iran in the past 40 years, but especially, let's say, from the summer of 1999, when students came out to the streets, in the summer in June 2009, when the Green Movement happened last year, I think people expect more from their country. People expect more from themselves. They do not like to be portrayed as an international pariah. They think that their country has a great potential to be an example for other countries in the region, and not be compared with Saudi Arabia, which, they don't want to even think about that. That's, that's not something they want to talk about. And the minorities in the country, of course, we have at least two different kind of religious minorities. We have Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, and Sunni Muslims of different kinds who are recognized religious minorities according to the Iranian constitution. And we have the Baha'is and Sufis and who are not even mentioned in the Iranian constitution, and we can call them third-class citizens. I think because of the way that the Iranian government has portrayed, especially I'd like to talk about the situation of the Baha'is, because of the way that the Iranian government has talked about the Baha'i community and has associated Baha'i community with many things that Iranians love and, like to be. Like, for example, Baha'is respect equality of men and women. They do not believe in the presence of necessity of clerics in their religion. So these things, they sound like, very good ideas to average Iranians. So as a result, I think the Baha'is, they've become an indelible part of this movement. I think we can call it a civil rights movement in the past few years, especially since 2009, when millions of people came to the streets. And I think the protests will continue because, again, Iranians have been in touch with the rest of the world, especially after the advent of the internet and satellite technology. Iranians have been more in touch with the rest of the world. They're not as isolated as they were, let's say, from 1979 to 1998, 1999. So I think the protests will continue. The regime will will have knee-jerk reaction to these protests because essentially the Iranian government, we can call it its 20th century dictatorship operating in the 21st century. It's an analog dictatorship. They know how to jam shortwave radio signals. They know how to shut down newspapers. They know how to imprison people. But when it comes to social media, when it comes to technology, when it comes to new concepts, they don't know what to do. So they resort to what they know best, which is shutting down newspapers, media, and imprisoning and torturing people. So I see this struggle will be continuing. Don't ask me when the regime is going to be changed, because I don't know when that is going to happen. And I think if anyone tells you that, that will be a lie. And I know that it's not short-term. There is no short-term, a quick solution to what is happening in Iran. And if anyone suggests a short-term, quick solution to the situation in Iran, that's a bad solution and will result in a bigger disaster like what we've seen in Syria, in Iraq, in Libya, etc.
Thank you. I think that's a very comprehensive overview of the domestic politics in Iran. But speaking of pressure, and moving to Alireza Nader, we've also seen pressure from the international community as well. So last Monday, Secretary of State Pompeo announced the lifting of waivers on countries that purchase oil from Iran. What effect has this had on minorities in the country, and what effect do you, as an analyst and frequent commentator on Iranian affairs, see as the effects of these lifting of sanctions for minorities, or of waivers for minorities?
Thank you for having me.
That's of course.
Thank you for having me. With the sanctions, so according to reports, there are about 5 million people who are dependent on oil revenues that are on the government's payroll. And once oil revenues go down close to zero, and they won't go quite down to zero, but very close to that, the Iranian regime is not going to have funds to sustain itself. Not just for the long term, in the short run, it won't have funds to sustain itself. It won't be able to pay employees of the government. It will have a difficult time paying the security forces. And this is already happening. A number of the Revolutionary Guards and the law enforcement forces are not getting their salaries. And I think overall, this will create a lot of instability. Just today, I read that the price of bread has increased 3 times, which is always an indication of instability in the Middle East in general, but specifically Iran as well. And the sanctions are definitely putting a lot of pressure on the regime. They put a lot of pressure on the population, obviously, and minority groups are always the worst off in Iran. You mentioned the flooding in Iran, and Iran just experienced some of its worst flooding in modern history. About $10 billion estimated damage, primarily in the southwest of Iran, where a lot of minorities reside. Arabs from Khuzestan, Lurs from Lorestan and Ilan province, and Khuzestan as well. And the regime has basically ignored them completely. Instead of helping out affected population, has sent Iraqi Shia militias, the Hashd al-Shabi and Hezbollah, into southwestern Iran, which I think is very indicative of the regime's stability. If it can't trust its own security forces, actual Iranians, and has to import foreign forces, that to me says this is not a very secure regime, or secure even in its ability to enforce this repressive rule. I think what we've seen in the last 17 months since the December 2017 protests, slowly the regime's ability to sustain itself through coercion is decreasing. And with the advent of sanctions and also other international crises like the crisis in Venezuela, if that succeeds, I think it succeeds in getting rid of Maduro, that also sends a message to Iranians fighting repression that this can be done even under the severest form of pressures and sanctions. But ultimately, Iranian minorities always pay the heaviest price, whether they're ethnic minorities or religious minorities. The Islamic Republic has shown that not only does it care about minorities or the general population, but it's willing to really exploit them for its own purposes. And that's what we see today in Iran, that despite the sanctions, despite the flooding, the Islamic Republic is still benefiting financially. For example, there's a report that Kuwait sent a lot of foreign aid and the Revolutionary Guard stole it all. So this is not a regime, forget about minorities, that can be counted to provide for the majority of the population.
So I think this is an important point about the role of unrest threatening minorities. Now, Marjan, as a human rights activist, you've advanced the idea that a peaceful society is a just society. So how do minorities in general, and in particular minorities in Iran, fit into that vision?
Thank you for the opportunity. So, absolutely, there is no justice, no peace without justice, and no justice without peace. And in the case of Iran and the Iranian minorities, where the constitution actually discriminates and provides a setting for institutional discrimination and bias, there is a fundamental problem that has to be reckoned with, and that is the institutional problem of discrimination and injustice that is based in the country. With institutional discrimination, there is also cultural change and cultural adaptation to accepting discriminatory attitudes and negative and biased attitudes toward a particular group, and treating individuals in an unfair and unjust and disrespectful manner. But, as Sharon mentioned earlier, it is important to look at the minorities in Iran and in all the other countries, because the way that governments treat their own people will also be an indication of how they will be treating others abroad, how they will be shaping their own foreign policies, and to what extent they're going to exercise their values toward external policies and other governments. And if they are not showing compassion and respect toward their own people, how are they going to treat their allies or their in other countries that they engage in contracts and treaties with? So interestingly, what we see with the Islamic Republic is that while it is oppressing its own minorities in Iran, they are often extending a helping hand to minorities abroad. And they want to build alliances with people of color in different, or minorities in different regions in Iraq, in the U.S., in Mexico. Why does the Supreme Leader have a Twitter handle in Spanish? What are his intents? Who is he trying to reach out to? So it's interesting to look at their strategies and to see that these external messages of compassion that are being communicated to other countries, to what extent are they willing to exercise that toward their own people? So something to just summarize what is going on in terms of treatment of minorities inside Iran. I will just touch up on a few items. And as I mentioned, there is the institutionalized racism and discrimination that takes place. There is also a big campaign of disinformation that we are noticing more and more. And I'm really happy that the USERF report has addressed this issue as well. And the disinformation campaign vilifies and directly tries to change the cultural views of individuals and put Iranians who have lived in Iran for generations, for hundreds of years, if not thousands, in a vilified and a negative perspective against one another. Furthermore, even though there are constitutional provisions by which Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians are protected with certain levels of privileges, and such as representation in the Iranian parliament, what we see are all the footnotes and the requirement for these communities not to mix with others when they're having their religious ceremonies, including weddings, including birthdays, including rites of passage ceremonies. So what is this encouraging the society to move toward? It is moving the society toward a policy of apartheid and separation. And by the way, we see the same treatment with the women. As the women are also being treated with apartheid and with lesser values and lesser regard on the Constitution. So And then the outcome of all of that is alienation of the marginalized communities who are not engaged, whose needs are not being met by the central government. So we are seeing the flood victims, for example. Many of them are Arabic speakers. They have been part of the Iranian soil for many years. But their needs are not being met. The Baluchi people, their needs are not sufficiently met. And rather than meeting the needs of these groups, the Iranian regime is charging these groups with allegations of national security and terrorism and acting against the state. Well, nobody wants to have terrorists in their midst, and any separatist behavior should be condemned and should be prosecuted. But the needs of these groups need to be listened to, and they need to be addressed in order to avoid further separatism and further alienation. I will stop here.
Maybe if I can just add one more thing, is that the Islamic regime, not only does this to its own people domestically, you see the fingerprints of the regime in Yemen in the way the Houthis are treating their own Baha'is. So you see that this export of the repression against a certain minority group is now expanded to the rest of the region, and the fingerprints of the Islamic Republic are everywhere. So that's really a disconcerting pattern that we're seeing now. And as you see what happens in Yemen and their own Baha'is and how they're being treated by the Houthis, it's really a disconcerting issue.
So there are Baha'i who are denied either entrance to or graduation from universities in Iran. There was a disturbing case of a woman who passed away in Iran who was Baha'i, and after she was buried, her body was dug up and moved outside of the cemetery. So what are the specific ways in which Iran's government targets members of the community, and how specifically do you see those fingerprints more broadly in the region?
With the Baha'is, you mean? Well, with the Baha'is, the main problem is that their right as a religion, they are not recognized in the constitution. So, there are many positions in the Iranian government. There are many things that only Shiites or only 12 Imam Shiites can do. But also, when you're applying for certain permissions for, different shops or different guilds or different corporations, you have to be a member of those 4 recognized religious groups. And the Baha'is, of course, they are not members, so they cannot apply for that. Same thing with the entrance examination of the universities. If a Baha'i lies and says that he or she is a Muslim, they can enter the university. But Baha'is do not lie, and they do not take the box for Judaism, Christianity, Islam, or Zoroastrianism, and as a consequence, they cannot enter the university. And Baha'i teachers cannot, of course, teach in Iranian universities. But it goes beyond that. As Marjan said, there is constant propaganda against the Baha'is on a daily basis. Baha'is are vilified on a regular basis at schools, on the radio and television, in different media, on different websites. So as a result, it seems that there is a push to just drive Baha'is, all Baha'is of Iran, into exile. We see similar pattern towards Jews and especially Jews, not as much traditional Christians and Zoroastrians as much, but we see that with Jews as well, that Jews face daily negative propaganda against Israel, of course, but also against Jews. And most of it, if not all of it, comes directly from the government. So when Foreign Minister Zarif comes to the UN and is interviewed by Christian Amanpour or Charlie Rose, not Charlie Rose anymore, but by someone else, and says that, by Chris Wallace, and says that, what happened to Charlie Rose, by the way? Yeah, anyways, Chris Wallace, and says that, it is not supported by the government. He uses this Persian two Persian words that we have for the government and the establishment. So, that of course the organization that supported the Holocaust cartoon exhibition, for example, is not part of the executive branch, which is Dolat in Persian. But it is supported by the Supreme Leader's office and the Revolutionary Guards, and it is part of the system. So much of this propaganda and much of the suppression, it comes directly from the government, and it's the government that implements all this propaganda and discrimination.
So looking at the Christian community, so of course there's the Assyrian Chaldean community and then the evangelical community as well. And so USERF has advocated as part of its Religious Prisoners of Conscience project for members of that community like Yusuf Nadarkhani, who was arrested for quote unquote promoting Zionist Christianity. So when we see these kinds of charges levied, what is the approach that actors outside of Iran can take to try and make a positive difference for securing the release or at least the safety of that community?
So I think one thing that's important to realize is Iran in the last 40 years has gone through an immense process of secularization. Attitudes toward religion and Islam have particularly changed. There is a very deep sense of, how should I put this in a very polite way, rejection of religion, particularly Islam. A lot of Iranians we know are converting to Christianity, evangelical Christianity, not the traditional Assyrian or Chaldean Christianity. There are also reports of a lot of Iranians converting to Zoroastrianism, Iran's pre-Islamic religion, although we'll never get an absolute sense of how many people because it's not measured and the regime in Iran doesn't want that known. But also, yet one thing we have to really keep in mind is the number of disbelievers and atheists and agnostics and secular Iranians, because I would argue they probably compose the majority of the population now, or even over people who may describe themselves as Muslim. And so that is one key aspect of Iran that's lost outside of Iran, particularly in DC. You hear a lot of analysts and scholars repeat the Islamic Republic's statistics that 90% of Iran's population is Shia Muslim. I, for one, do not believe that. I don't think that 90% of Iran's population is practicing Shia Muslim. No way that a country like that would, have that characteristic. But I think just getting the information out there, informing people that this is the sort of society Iran is now, that there are a lot of atheists. It's not just a matter of people who reject the Islamic Republic's ideological line, but people who reject religion. And they're fleeing in Iran on a very regular basis, and their lives are in danger. But publicizing that and being very skeptical about anything the regime in Iran says about minorities, I think, should be the number one principle of any analyst or activist.
Sorry, going back to your question about what can be done is that, by the way, Ali and I, we had our disagreement about the number of seculars and atheists in Iran earlier in the day. And I still think that the majority of Iranians, they believe in Islam. They do not believe in the Islamic Republic as such. And in fact, I traveled a lot in Qom and Najaf, and I can say that most of the clerics I've met in Qom and Najaf, they are against the Islamic Republic as a form of government because they think that it's destroying the Shia seminary as an institution, as an independent institution. But going to back to your question about what can be done about the human rights violators and those people who suppress religious minorities, either the Baha'is or evangelical Christians. I believe there can be targeted sanctions. It is not very difficult to research and to find out who are the human rights violators who are suppressing Christians, evangelical Christians and the Baha'is in Iran, naming them, shaming them, and subject them to targeted sanctions. And one thing that can be done is to find out what are the commercial and economic activities of these people and target those economic activities of these groups, because many of them, they belong to an organization that owns certain companies, and those companies operate outside of Iran. So those companies can be targeted because of violating human rights of these minorities, whether Baha'i or evangelical Christians.
So, Martin, I wanted to circle back to a point that you had made about women and the treatment of women. One of the areas USERP has focused on is the intersection of women and religious freedom, but we can bring other gender groups in as well. So how does the regime's repression of religious minorities affect, in particular, women on the one hand, and members of the LGBTI community on the other?
Sure. In terms of the repression of women, I think you have a broad practice that doesn't really discriminate so much between one group versus another. Although when it comes to the hijab, of course, the hijab is not something that is practiced by other religious groups. Sure, there are Jewish and Catholic, Christian practices of modesty rules, but not the interpretation of the Shia Islam and the regime's view of the hijab. But nonetheless, it is a mandatory enforced practice that is imposed upon the women, regardless of their religious views. And given that there are many women who are, many men and women who are secular, who don't believe in a religion at all, and they would rather just be free and make their own decisions about their attire. Nonetheless, the regime is imposing this practice on a daily basis on women and telling them exactly how they should appear from the moment that they're going outside to claim their individuality and to go about their own individual lives. Women in Iran are also regarded as second-class citizens and subject to harsher treatment according to the Constitution and the Penal Code. So the Iranian Constitution regards women's testimony as half of that of a man's. The tort cases, the woman is regarded, again, as 50% lower than her male counterpart. And so, for example, if there is an accident and there are two people in a car, one is a male, one is a female, when there are times for reparations, for receiving insurance money, the woman is going to receive half of what her male counterpart has received. There was a very gripping case of a fire in a school in Neyshabur, where children, mostly girls, forget the name of the city. These children, mostly girls, were in a classroom, and the furnace in the classroom. Where was it? Zahida. Caught fire, and these children got burned severely. Their faces were burned, and when they wanted to get some kind of a compensation for their pain and suffering, they had to go through major legal ordeals to get what they deserved. And because only because of their gender, they are not allowed to receive a fair share of what they deserve. So this, again, institutionalized discrimination and how it shapes opinions and how it shapes culture. One other thing to add is that, as if the Constitution by itself was not enough for repressive on the women, the Penal Code also has a whole other series of punishments and provisions that really puts women at a disadvantage. Included upon them is, on the case of honor killing, which thankfully is not as frequently practiced, but it is still there, and as well as blood money is something to consider. As for LGBT and gender minorities, it was said before, and I think it is just mind-boggling to even repeat that in 2019 there are countries that practice execution on individuals who simply because of their choice of who they love. So being LGBTQ in Iran, and they don't have any of these acronyms there, it is considered a crime, and it is punishable by death. And just recently, a man was executed because of that. And it is not really sufficiently spoken about. There has not been enough uproar and concern about this. Of course, there are many groups that have religious views about this. Nonetheless, this is a human rights issue, and it should trump any religious view that exists. And it is something that is accepted by the UN and promoted by the UN as well. And we have to support the rights of LGBT individuals inside of Iran.
Sorry, I was just very surprised that it's only after 2006 that you've made Iran a country of particular concern, because I think since 1979, Iran was a country of particular concern. And also, when you think about what Marjan says, it should not be news to people who followed Khomeini's movement, because when he started his movement in 1962 against the Shah, he did not. It was not a movement against dictatorship and for democracy. It was a movement against women's right to vote and against the Baha'i freedom that was given to the Baha'is to practice their faith in Iran. And Khomeini wrote a letter to the Shah saying, your Majesty, giving the right to women to vote is going to lead to decadence and prostitution. And these Baha'is are agents of Israel. So I think this is deep-rooted in the history of the Islamic Republic, in the Islamic Republic itself. So I was wondering why only since 2006 Iran was called.
Yeah, so this is for you, sort of when we first started formally listing countries. Right. So since we've been doing this, Iran has been on our list.
And one strength of this task force, which I believe even in the last day or so of meetings that we've had, is the first time we're meeting in person, is giving a more holistic view of issues of human rights and religious freedom challenges in the region as a whole. So because the makeup of the task force is diverse from Iran to Syria to Egypt to Turkey, there are thematic challenges that we can come and speak to in a way that is more of a unifying principles. We can learn from one another, and we can speak to these issues in a way that I think is more holistic and not uniquely featuring one country. So even in the case of Iran, when we do comparisons with Turkey and when we do comparisons with other member states of our task force, the idea of comparing and contrasting and looking at thematic issues, I think, is the strength of this task force. What we hope to do as a group is to put out more products, to do more writing, to elevating the issues across countries and across the region. Along those thematic lines, for example, one of the issues that has come up for us is media and state-owned news, and how they are used to propagate repression of minorities across the region. Television shows such as those that you'll hear in the next panel in Turkey, and how they're being used now as a cultural tool available to governments to repress, and Iran does that as well. So the task force hopes to elevate these issues, bring light to other ways that both our legislators and our executive branch can put pressure on these issues. And to really be a resource out there to make sure those both in the NGO world and in governments can continue to talk about these things so they're not forgotten.